Okay. So now I am going to be taking you through this question, being question number 6, whereby they say in the diagram below, the graph of f of x equals -2 cos x. Yes, f of x equals -2 cos x is drawn for the interval 0 degrees from 0 degrees to 360, meaning between 0 degrees and 360 degrees. So this is another way in which they write that format. But otherwise, we do know very well what it means. Okay, then it's fine. Of course, we can see that function of f of x, which is -2 cos x. It is drawn for that interval. So now let's start looking at the questions. So 6.1, they want you to write down the amplitude of f. Write down the amplitude of f. You see, it's just 1 mark. All that you have to do is just to go and write it. Otherwise, if you want to, you can still calculate and say the amplitude, it has to be half of that maximum value and that minimum value, which is going to be half of 4. What is half of 4? Half of 4 is equals to 2. So that means all that you have to do is just to say a equals 2. In that way, already you've just given the value of, so you need to be very careful. You cannot say the amplitude is -2. So that means you can't take the whole of that as it is. The amplitude, you always write it as a positive value. So that means in this case, you've got many ways in which you can get your amplitude. You can get it straight away from the equation itself, where you just write it down from there. But remember, you write it as a positive value. Alternatively, you still have this maximum value and that minimum value. Then you can work it out in order to get to that value. Be very, very careful. So you are now being exposed to other ways in which you can get your altitude. Not altitude, but amplitude. Okay, then it's fine. So now the next question wants you to write down the minimum value of that function. Look at this. You're given only 1 mark. What do they say? You just have to write it down, meaning don't need to calculate, you just have to write it down. So, okay, let's see. You might need to do a bit of a calculation there, just a bit of a calculation there to say, if the minimum value for this function, which is f of x, if the minimum value, it is that -2. Now you have to plus it by 3. The answer that you get, it becomes your new minimum value. Perhaps you might appreciate if I show it to you differently. Remember, you are now having that f of x, which is equals to what? F of x equals to the whole of this. So what they are saying there is that f of x, you now plus it by 3. So what it means is you write f of x exactly as it is, which is that, what is it? That -2 cos of x. It's like now what you do, it is to plus it by 3. So that means if you had to have this function and then you shift it up by 3 units, it still retains the same shape, but you've just shifted it by 3 units up. then where will it be? So that means it will no longer make U10 at -2, but at 1, 2, 3. So that means this is where now it was going to make a new U10. Can you see? It was therefore going to be like that. So now this is the new maximum value, but this is the new minimum value. So that means one day they can say what will be the maximum value. But this time around, they're asking about the minimum value. And that's what I'm doing here to show you in terms of how you calculate that minimum value. I hope that part makes sense. I am hoping that that part makes sense. So that means if the amplitude here, it is 2, then you still shift it by 1, 2, 3 in order to get to the maximum value. So if you're having there, it will be 3, 4, and then having 5 there. Something of that nature, the honorable member. I'm just not trying to limit your understanding based on the questions, but I'm trying to somehow broaden that. Okay, so now they want you on 6.3 on the same system of axes. Draw the graph of G, whereby G of x equals sine x plus 1 for the interval being that. So that means for that same interval you plot, you can still say, okay, I'll find my critical points. You will definitely find that your critical points will be 90. So that means you still have your 90 there, that and that and that. And then from there, you just input the angle there starting from 0, and then you start plotting from there. Something of that nature, the honorable member. Let me just remove that. I think it will be best for me to try and draw that, because the upcoming questions will be based on this new drawing. So let me just draw it, even though it may not be accurate, but at least for you to have an idea. I might find that maybe there's to make a 10 there, and perhaps there, there, and then perhaps there. And then starting from there, maybe I might find that it does something like that, it does that, and then it does that, and there it ends there. Yes, something of that nature, the honorable member. And then this one, it is that function of G name. Okay, then it's fine. So here under 6.4, they say use the graphs, meaning both. Use the graphs to determine the following. They want you to determine the value of f of 180 minus g of 180. So that means for that graph of f, where you see x, you will put 180. So it's like you're having -2 cos of 180. You will have to minus it with the graph of G, which is that one. So that means it will be sine, where you see x, you put 180, and then what else? You plus it by 1. Then you may find that when you punch this, when you punch that, where x is 180, definitely we can already see, even in the function, that it has to be 2. Maybe when you punch that, it gives you +2. And then with this one, perhaps you can already see that, okay, that one, it has to be 1. and then minus that one, it gives us 1. And then it's like you have 2 minus 1, which ends up being 1. So that means the difference between these two functions, it is actually 1. That's what we are basically doing there, to say the difference between these two functions, it's actually a length of 1. So that means from there up to that one there, along that line of 180, that difference, it is actually 1. That's what we were doing there as we were calculating. But most importantly, when something is written like this, name of the graph, and then inside they don't put x, but they put a value, that's what you substitute on that function. And then they say the name being g, for that one, if they put 180, then it means for on that function where you see x, you put 180, or if it was theta, you put that, whatever the case may be. So here, another tricky question where they may be saying, for which value or values of x will this function of f, because there's a dot in between, then it means when you take that function of f and you multiply it with that function of g, you will get greater than 0. So it's like they are saying, for which y values of this function of f, when you multiply it with the y values of this function of g, will be greater than 0. So we know that when something is greater than 0 is positive. So that means when you take the y value of f and you multiply it with the y value of g, it must lead you to a positive answer, greater than 0. So you therefore look at this function, and then you will therefore realize that it is only where we are having these graphs being above the 0 line. This is the 0 that we are talking about, that 0 line. And you will therefore realize that actually between this point and that point, those are the values whereby when you multiply those two graphs, they will give you a positive value, because between 90 and 270, that's where they are above the 0 line. Let me show you what I mean by that. You see, between on that section alone, it is above 0. Nay. And this one also, between that same section, that's when it is above 0. But outside that range, that's when you have this section of the graph being above 0, and then this section being below 0. So that means this is the positive side of the y, this is the negative side of the y. So if you multiply positive by a negative, you will not get a value which is greater than 0. When we say the value is greater than 0, we are simply saying it is positive. Similarly, you see this section after 270, you have y values being positive, but y values being negative. So when you multiply those values, when you multiply with these values, they end up giving you a negative value, because it's a positive y value and a negative y. So it's more like we are looking at a section whereby all the functions are above that 0 line. That's what we are looking for. That is what we are looking for. So that is why we say it's only between 90 and 270, whereby both the graphs are above the 0 line. That's when we know that, okay, that's where we will get values which are greater than that. So that means outside that range, when you multiply they will be below 0. So in answering this question, we will therefore say it is actually where those x values are between 90 degrees and 270 degrees. So this inequality sign, it is greater than. It's not that one of greater or equals to. That is why even there I'm using that one of less than. So be careful of that. But if it was greater or equals to, then I was still going to put the that and the equal to there. Very, very much important that you understand how the inequalities work, because if you don't, then you're going to be in trouble. That is why it's very much important that you don't skip the lessons, but you do all the lessons that we did from term 1, because they include this part of focusing on the inequalities. So that means if the question, for example, there, it was not greater than, but let's say it was less than, then it means we are looking at where you are having a positive multiplying with a negative. And that section, it is this one and that one. So it would therefore be, that's where the x values are actually between 0 and 90. Yes, that would be between 0 degrees and 90 degrees, which means within this section or between this section, that's where they would actually give you negative when you multiply, or a value which is less than 0 when you multiply. Not only that, but also this section, that section, and that section. So for that one, it would therefore be where x, it is between 270 degrees and 360 degrees. So that means you would give that answer and that answer. I hope that part makes sense. Okay, then it's fine. So now they are saying 6.5, the graph of f, the graph of f is reflected about the x-axis. The graph of f is reflected about the x-axis and then moved 3 units to form the new graph being h. Okay, I don't think it's a complicated matter, because when the graph of f, which one is the graph of f? Let's see, the graph of f is that original one of -2 cos x. We know when it's reflected that a changes, then it shifts 3 units downwards to form the new graph. So that means if we have to determine h of x, it will have to be, originally it was -2. So because it reflects about the x-axis, it changes to become now +2 cos x, and then because it shifts by 3 units downwards, then it is -3. That's it. That's it, honorable member. No need to worry that much. Straightforward, you just easily write it down. Okay, so now remember, it is the graph of f that they were talking about, the one that had to now reflect about that, and then from there move whatever units. So now they are saying find the range of h for that same interval. So you see now, they now want to, they want you to find the range. So from what I understand is that in terms of the range, let's do this. I'm just going to remove all of this so that at least what I'm explaining, it is clear. I think I will need to show you the reflection in terms of how the reflection looks like. We'll have to show you in terms of how the reflection will look like. Okay, so this is how the reflection looks like. So when it reflects about that, it's like you're just flipping it about that horizontal line. That's what you are doing. You are just paging it about that line. So that means you are just flipping it upside down. In other words, you will make the turning point on this side, and then it will touch there on that side, and then there, that side, but it will still be swinging at those same points. So that means what it does now, exactly the same shape, except now it is that. You see, that's when something rotates about the thing. So now that it has been reflected about the x-axis, we now have to shift it. We shift it by what? By 3 units down. So that means that same function, it will now have to start at 1, 2, 3. See now. So that means it has to now do this. It has to now do this. It has shifted. And then it does that. Something of that nature. Can you see? So that means even this, even that, it now shifts by how many units? By 3 units. Let me just be realistic there. And let me just be realistic there. Let's say this. Right. And then do that. Then do that. Yes. So that means even that new minimum is no longer -2, but the new minimum will be at 1, 2, 3. This will now be the new minimum. So that new minimum should be from -2, -4, no, from -2, it is -3, -4, and then -5. So you see now, that means the new range, that new range, it has to be now, you remember I said the range you just do like that, and then it means the new minimum, it is that -5, new minimum, the new maximum, it is that -1. Yes, something of that nature, the honorable member. If you don't want to write it like that, you will therefore say y is the element of, you do this thing of the 4 corners and say we have that -5 and then that -1. Yes, you start with the minimum and then after you write the maximum. Something of that nature, the honorable member. I hope that part makes sense. Trust me when I say it can only make sense when you do this thing over and over again. You do not just do it once and then from there it feels like you know how to work it out. Nope, that is not how it works. You have to do this thing as many times as possible. That is the only way in which they will make sense. So now we